Anyway, let me get on with what I feel God's speaking to me about and hopefully to us as a community. And last week, we talked about who is God. And I said, is he a he, is he a she, is he an it, is he a they? Is he loving, is he mean, is he close, is he far, is he strong, is he weak? You can go listen to all this. I'm going to rush through and just give you a summary of what I did last week. And I said to everybody that your answer to that question will define and set up and shape the trajectory of your life and your destiny here on Project Planet Earth. And I love this quote from Tozer. We tend to, by a secret law of the soul, to move towards a mental image of God. And what comes to mind when we think about God is the most important thing about us. So the question is what do you think about God? Who do you think God is? Because ultimately that's going to, it might be wrong, it might be right, but everybody has a picture of who God is. And what we found out last week was, God is a person to be known. He's not this force, he's not this idea, he's not this concept, he's not this religion, he's not this system, he's not the church, he's none of that stuff. He's relational, and he wants to relate to us. He wants to know and be known. He wants a relationship with you and me, and it's all through and in Jesus. And the key here, though, is we must go to the right source to find out who he is. And I was just thinking, as we were in worship, a lot of what we believe, and even some of the worship songs, of who is in the throne room and all of those kind of things. And we did Revelation last year. And I know with some of the visitors, guess what? Angels don't have wings. But that's what our society has portrayed them to be. In a certain way, we see angels and demons have got little horns, and you've got a little angel on this shoulder and a little devil on that shoulder. And Dante's Inferno is prescribed to Western culture, all of what that should look like, and we actually get it so wrong. So the question is we want the right picture of God. Why don't we go to God himself and let's hear what he has to say? And this is the text that we're going to stick in, and I'll certainly be, and hopefully some people will be joining me in preaching this. And it says, then Yahweh came down in a cloud and stood there with him. So by the way, in your Bible, when it's got capital Lord, that's actually Yahweh. And last week I described why we should be calling God Yahweh and not Lord. And you can go and remember what it is? The karate? Hiya! Is the Hebrew word to be. And remember, Yahweh is He is, where He says I am. So it's the third person. So it says He is. All right, so anyway, you can go listen to it last week and get all the grammar, etc. But the Lord came down in a cloud and stood next to him and proclaimed his name, Yahweh. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, Yahweh, Yahweh, the compassionate and gracious Elohim, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. He does not leave the guilty unpunished, but he punishes the children and their children, and for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. And we're going to get into all of that in the weeks to come. The point is this is ground zero for the theology of God. This is the most quoted verse in the Bible by the Bible. And I emphasized that a lot last week. Now, what we have here is he goes, I'm Yahweh, Yahweh, your God. Before he gets into all of that. So that's how that progression kind of goes. But he says it twice. What do we do in the English language when we want to highlight something or emphasize something? We italics it, or we underline it, or we do something like that. But in the Hebrew, they would say it twice. That's why my first preach of this year, when Jesus is speaking to Martha, he goes, Martha, Martha. He's like really wanting her to understand that he is going to say something profound right after that. But the question is, why does God need a name? What's wrong with the word God or Elohim or whatever it might be? And the reason is because there are many gods. Like, stick with me. People are thinking, oh, Gary's gone into polytheism. He's got some crossing over to Hinduism and stuff. Just stick with me. I'm not. What do you mean many gods? Great question. Okay, so Yahweh is the name of our God. Elohim is actually a word for God. It's for a spiritual being. And we need to understand that, because otherwise we get this wrong. And through the translations and through time, people have taken that or changed it in the Bible to mean Lord or Adonai, or as I explained it all last week. The point is, it's a title of a spiritual being. But there is only one creator God. All those other gods are created by God himself. Yahweh created these other spiritual beings, which he calls Elohim, which we have in the Bible call gods. I can see people are frowning at me thinking, where's this guy gone? So the Exodus story is a great way, and obviously we're in Exodus. Remember what's happened is Israel, they've gone there. You remember how all that happened with Joseph and, him getting sold into slavery and his brothers come in there, and finally Jacob arriving there, and they stick around, and the Pharaohs change, and now they are put into slavery. Now they start to have to build everything, and they become laborers for Pharaoh. And what's happening now, though, is Yahweh approaches Moses, and I explained all of this last week. And he says, I want you to go and rescue my people. And what he does is he does it via 10 plagues. But those plagues are directed towards specific deity, specific gods, specific, and when I say gods, lower G, gods, deity, in terms of all of that. So let me show you this. The 10 plagues of Egypt versus the 10 Egyptian gods. I'm not going to go into it, but there you go. Those were the gods that they worshiped. When they wanted certain things, they would actually pray towards these gods. And Louise came into my study yesterday and she said, you know what, Gary? God actually totally dismantled and shut down the entire worship system of these gods in Egypt at the time. Think about that. Shut it down. Surely that's what we should be praying for. God, shut down the worship of other gods in our city. Those who have been blinded by all of the challenges and everything else that comes down. So let's go back to the Exodus story and let's look, because Amnon-Ra was the sun god, and many of us have heard that, Ra and Amnon-Ra. He was the chief god over all the gods, and what does God do in one of those moments? He just shuts out the sun for 3 days and goes, yeah, buddy, where's your power now? So Exodus 12, on the same night I will pass through Egypt, and I will strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all Elohim, gods of Egypt, for I am Yahweh. You see, I'm going to show you more scriptures now. Now, I've been working through Exodus just in my devotional times, and there's a couple of things, what I was thinking of. Let me ask you this question. Who threw down their staff and turned into a snake in Pharaoh's court? See, everyone thinks it's Moses. It's not. Go read. It's Aaron. See what happens when we start to... Now, yes, at the burning bush, he did it with Moses. But go in and you'll see, actually, Aaron is the staff that's thrown on the floor. And like I said in my first week of preaching, was when I came back from the break, was how is it that we as Christians live our lives based on the Bible, but we never read it? If you are living your life based on excerpts and Sunday sermons, how can you actually say that you're following Jesus? I'm not trying to make you guilty. I'm actually trying to encourage you. Read the Bible so that God can lead you in the ways in which He's wanting to lead you. Anyway, let's get on with it. So all of this, there's actually a cosmic war. I don't know if you guys remember Bronze preached from, 2-3 years ago, that we are born into a war. It's exactly what we are born into. If you look throughout the Bible, and I know some people say, yeah, but God's a genocidal God. He cleared out nations. He killed women and children and all that kind of stuff. Why don't you go look at the context? Go look at what gods were actually in those spaces. The Watchers, the Nephilim, all of those things. God cleared out those nations because they had become so wicked. So we're born into a cosmic war between Yahweh and some of those Elohim that He created. And that's why most of that war happens in Scripture. So Exodus 15, then Moses and the Israelites sang a song. So they've just come through the Red Sea. God has drowned the Egyptians in 2 inches of water, which is a bigger miracle. People say it wasn't in flood. It was a joke, by the way. Then Moses and Israel sang the song to Yahweh. I will sing to Yahweh, for He is highly exalted. Yahweh is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. He is my Elohim, and I will praise Him as my father's Elohim, and I will exalt Him. Who among the Elohim is like you? Yahweh. You see, when you start to put the right words in the right places, you start to see that actually there are other gods. Now, follow me and stay with me, please. Yahweh is king. Yahweh is the only creator. Yahweh is the only one. Monotheistic, one God, creator of all things, all-powerful, king of all. He's the one who defeated Amnon-Ra and all the other gods. He's in a class of his own. That's why we've read those scriptures, and he's the only one that deserves our worship. Look at the Psalms. There is none like you among the Elohim. Great is Yahweh, and greatly to be praised, and he is to be revered above all Elohim. Worship him, all you gods, or you Elohim, for Yahweh, you are most high above all the earth, and you are exalted above all the Elohim. See, can you see through the scriptures and through the translations, we can lose the essence of what God, and you'll see, I'm going to make a point about this. The 10 commandments, what are the first 2 commandments? Well, I'll show you. I am the Lord your God, Yahweh your Elohim, who brought you out of Egypt, out of slavery. You shall have no other Elohim, gods, before me. You shall not make for yourself an image, an idol, in the form of anything in heaven above or on earth beneath or the waters below. You shall not bow to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, Yahweh your Elohim, I am a jealous Elohim. Now we're starting to get there. See, in our Western culture, we conflate those two things. We were in a meeting at work the other day, and I mentioned this word conflate, and everyone says, what are you talking about? What does conflate mean? You join them together, and you confuse the two. So in our Western culture, we think an idol, if like, I know some people worship chocolate. See, here's I haven't touched sugar since the 3rd of Jan. Lord Jesus, help me. I just broke the 10th commandment. But thou shalt not covet, if those don't know. So many of us worship an idol. It's an object. But the reality is an idol is like a shadow is to a human being. It's got no power, it's whatever. But in all of this, what we do is we conflate these things and we think idols are powerful. No, it's the gods behind the idols that we worship. So if you're worshiping a certain particular God, generally there's an idol that represents that God. It's not the idol itself, it's dead, it's useless. But actually, behind it is the principalities and powers that we would worship. And it's important for us to understand because those gods are powerful. Those spiritual beings that God created are powerful. What do you mean, Gary? Well, what happened in Pharaoh's courts? Aaron throws down his rod, turns into a snake. What do the magicians do? Throw down their stuff, turns into... They just copied every single thing that they were doing, except a few of them, obviously, at the end. Here's another question to you. When did God tell Pharaoh he was going to take his firstborn? Was it at the beginning of the plagues or was it at the end? No, it was at the beginning. Go read the scriptures. They go to Pharaoh right away and they said, if you don't do this, because Israel are my sons, God says, my first sons and daughters, and if you don't let them go, I'm going to take yours. We all think it kind of built up, built up, and then he went, Katwa. No, he told them right in the beginning. You see, again, we don't read our scriptures, and then we land up with a slightly different aspect of who God is. God gave Pharaoh plenty of time. We won't get into the hard and hot thing because that's a whole preach in itself. The point is Yahweh's a jealous God. And it's not this jealousy. Jealousy is like you want to stop your child from running into them playing in the traffic, right? You want to stop your child from going buying drugs at a drug den and from a prostitute house or whatever it might be. That's the jealousy he's talking about. We think, jealousy is bad. But no, when you are there to protect and look after, jealousy is a really, really good thing. So let's have another look at our friend Solomon. This crazy dude, the wisest man in all the world, and yet he's got 700 wives and 300 concubines. I can't even keep one wife happy. I don't know how he did all of these. The point is, verse 4, as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart towards other Elohim, gods. And his heart was not fully devoted to Yahweh. He followed Ashtoreth and the goddess of Elohim, the goddess, which is Elohim, of the Sidonians, Moloch, the detestable God, the god or Elohim of the Amorites, etc., etc. And he took his eyes off Yahweh and didn't follow his ways. So all of this, notice, Power over geographical and ethnic groups. How is this working? And the gods are named, right? They've actually got names. That's why we want to name God Yahweh and not something else, just God. It's like calling your cat, cat. Who remembers our series on what does God want and all of those good things? What was the overarching thing here? Was that Deuteronomy 32:8? It says, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind and he fixed the boundaries of peoples according to the number of the sons of God. So we start to unpack this and we start to see that what happened in Deuteronomy 32 is Moses is telling what happened at the Tower of Babel. When the Tower of Babel happened, you read, God actually disinherited the nations and said, okay, you guys that I've created, you look after them. I'm going to start afresh with Abraham and Sarah. Ultimately, what Jesus does is he brings the nations back into his fold. And it's an already but not yet. It's not fully consummated. It will happen. But it's really important for us to understand that. Now, part of this, why I'm saying this, is that, and I've got this up here. How many of us kind of, when you drive into a city, those who are very discerning, you go, whoa, what was that? When you walk in certain aspects of a town or wherever you go. I know when we drive down to Cape Town, which is really a long, long drive. I don't enjoy driving. But you go through Colesberg. It's like, whoa, Mufasa. Who else feels that when they go through Colesberg? Why? Because there is a spiritual being or something there that you know is not lacquer. How many times when you walk in a crowd and you walk past someone, you go, whoa, what was that? Those of you who are highly discerning, that's what's happening. I remember Louise and I driving, and Louise is highly discerning. I'm kind of a little bit more doof. But we were driving, again, it was in Cape Town of all things, and we drove to visit her grandparents, and we drove through this place, and it was like, I said, Louise, what was that? And she said, yeah, did you feel that too? You see, we stop thinking and feeling about what's going on around us spiritually because everything's around microscopic. As long as I can prove it, and here it is. But there is a world, there is the kingdom of God, and there's a spiritual world that's here. It's a realm. It's not up there and down there. It's a realm. And if we understand that, then you look at something like Daniel 10, where Daniel says, I was stopped from coming because I was warring against other Elohim. It's important for us to understand that. The Prince of Persia, powerful, authority, geographical region. They've been assigned. So our modern view is we've got these angels and demons and the little horns and the wings. That's got nothing to, that's not in the Bible. Cherubim have, yes, but not angels. And it's the language of the Bible, and we need to understand that the Bible's not wrong. It's just man who's translated it in different ways. So Psalm 82, what an amazing psalm. God has taken his place in the divine council. Now, I'll show you in a moment, you can see that NIV and other translations call it the Great Assembly, or the sons of God, as we'll get into. In the midst of the Elohim, the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hands of the wicked. They are neither have knowledge or understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods. You are Elohim, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, you will die like men. And you will fall like any prince. And then there's this prayer, O rise, O Elohim, God, judge of the earth, and you shall inherit the nations, which comes through Jesus when he does what he does on the cross and through his resurrection. You see, when we start to see all of this unfold, and that's why I'm taking my time going through the scriptures, it's not just in one place. This is God saying to these non-ahead other gods that actually you reckon the nations. I handed them over you to rule and to reign righteously and justly. And you haven't. And so what I'm telling you is stop this havoc. Stop this injustice. Stop all of this stuff because you're not bringing the peace, the shalom of God into those spaces. And so I'm going to take you out, which he will do at the consummation of this age. And all the brokenness and violence and everything else is because of these gods. Remember what I said, this is a series that John Mark Comer did. I'm literally re-preaching it in many ways. And so I want to give him honor for all the contents. God Has a Name is his book. And you can go and read it online, etc. And you can get it in the shops. And I remember him saying, just before he preached this they had 3 school shootings in Denver. All within 10 miles, he called it, because obviously they use miles, of one another. Why is that? How can you have 3 school shootings in the same vicinity, same geographical area? Because you've got a malevolent punk of a God who is speaking chaos and disorganized chaos into that space. I'm not going to go through all this text, but remember the story of Jesus, and he comes to the area of the Gerasenes, and he comes out, and there's this guy who's got an impure spirit, and he's been cutting himself, and they can't even chain him up. He's breaking chains, he's so strong because he's demon-possessed. And they ask him, Jesus asked the spirit, well, who are you? And he says, I'm Legion. And as you can see, my Legion is 5,000 soldiers, up to 5,000 soldiers. Because this guy was totally, you can imagine. Now, if you look at all of this and what happens, and then ultimately he said, these demons are scared of Jesus. They're fearful of him. And they say, don't send us out of the area. Can you start to see the patterns of what's happening? What is happening in Joburg? What is the prevailing God of Joburg? What is the prevailing God of Durban, Cape Town, these big cities? What is the prevailing God in these particular regions that you might visit regularly? It's important to understand what these are and to speak the opposite spirit into those areas. So what he does is he casts the demons out into a bunch of pigs and they run off the cliff. Now, why am I telling you this? Because you see Jesus right away, when he starts his ministry, he starts to war against these principalities and powers. And we too, and I'll get into that, we don't war on our own. I'll explain that in a moment. But the point is the dark kingdom has an agenda. And Jesus says to steal, kill, and destroy. He wants chaos. And what you can see is Jesus comes with his authority, because all authority on heaven and in heaven and on earth, is being given to him. And then he delegates that to us. It's interesting that Ephesians 6, it talks about all this stuff, about the armor of God. And then it says, for we struggle not against flesh and blood. So guess what? You're not my enemy. Guess what? Donald Trump is not our enemy. Guess what? Jacob Zuma, Cyril Ramaphosa, the neighbor, the friend at school, your boss, the person that works for you that's not doing what, they are not the enemy. We struggle against principalities, Paul's language always, principalities, powers, all of those kind of things. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 10 says that the church will reveal the manifold wisdom of God to the principalities and powers. We are called to be doing that. And all of the stuff is that we come against it. And so Paul understood this. It's not against nations. It's not against ethnicity. It's not against flesh and blood. It's against these gods. And it's important for us to understand this, because these are created gods that have taken over, and they've got free will, and they're in this invisible realm. Now, I know that many of Christians struggle with the supernatural. They're skeptics. I'm pretty sure here you're going, has this guy lost his mind? For you visitors, you're going, why did we come to this church this morning? But I want to show you, because it's really important for us to understand, because our culture actually says unless we can see it and put it under a microscope, it's superstitious nonsense. And yet when we read the Bible and what I've read you, it's clearly not. Not once did it say that these things aren't real. Hey? Not once. So what is your worldview? Now, what's a worldview? It's a set of beliefs about fundamental aspects of reality that ground and influence all our perceiving, our thinking, our knowing, and our doing. In other words, the way you perceive the world to be and why you are here will determine how you walk out your life. What is your worldview? Do you have the worldview of the Bible and of Jesus, or have you learned it from Western culture? So let's have a quick look at 3 quick, big worldviews. Universalism. Now, I'm going to use the analogy. If we had a mountain, universalism says there's a mountain and God's at the top. Think of Zeus in the Greek mythology type picture. And what happens is that there's multiple pathways up. If you want to go climb Table Mountain, you can go climb it multiple ways. It's the same thing. If you want to get to God, well, there's Allah, there's Buddhism, there's Hinduism. You just climb up the path, but ultimately it's the same God on top of that mountain. That's what universalism is. Everybody understand that, right? Now that sounds wonderful. And I know when I first became a Christian and I had to work through this, and I know many people struggle with this because how can God not save those? And I'll get into that in a moment. But the point is ultimately this universalism is not true because there are similarities, absolutely, but there are chasms of differences that ultimately will land people not meeting Jesus, not meeting Yahweh, not going to heaven in it for eternity because they've actually chosen a different path. But we'll get into that. Now, this is what most of you, I'm pretty sure, and most of Christians believe, is monotheism. Okay? What happened was that, again, think of the mountain, monotheism. We've got God at the top of the mountain, and Jesus is the pathway up to him. Do we agree? I think most of us are happy with that. But actually, all the other gods are false gods. They're not real. So Allah is not a real God. The nirvana aspects for Buddha is not real. And Wicca, and I can keep going, the spirituality, those things aren't real. They're false, they're useless, they're shadows. But actually, when we look at Jesus in the Bible, there are actually many mountains with gods on each mountain. But there's only one mountain where Yahweh sits, and the only way to get to Yahweh is through Jesus Christ. Now, you see, that changes a whole bunch of stuff. And I'm going to get into that in a moment. Because if we understand that Jesus is the only way to Yahweh, and it sounds so jarring and almost offensive, because there's actually these multiple mountains. And the question is are you climbing the right mountain? Here's the implications. What we think about the gospel, what we think about evil, and what we think about our spirituality. So what do you think about the gospel? Haven't you heard people saying, I'm spiritual, but I don't serve any particular God? Well, you are serving a God because you are climbing a specific mountain. That's the bottom line. What spirit are you worshiping? What God are you worshiping? Because what mountain are you climbing? See, God, the word, is no longer the common denominator anymore because you've got multiple gods. The beautiful thing is Jesus came down the mountain. That's the beautiful thing about Jesus. Everyone, all the other gods are getting you to go to them and that you earn your way to go up. Whereas God himself, Yahweh, because Jesus is Yahweh, comes down the mountain and he says, come follow me. And obviously describes himself in the Exodus text. The question is, what path are you on? The other implication is, what do you think about evil? You see, so many people do not believe in God because they can't get over this concept of if God is all powerful and he's all loving, why is there so much suffering in this world? Good question. I understand that. And some years ago, I preached on faith, and there's a book written by Lee Strobel called The Case for Creation. And Lee Strobel, as you know, was an atheist, went out to prove his wife that God didn't exist, and now is one of the preeminent theologians and preachers of this world. But he wrote a book called The Case for Christ, but he also did a case for creation. And he goes, because he was a journalist, he goes and he interviews people. And he goes and interviews a contemporary of Billy Graham, who's now no longer serving God. He says, why aren't you serving God? He says, because I saw a picture of an Ethiopian baby dying of hunger, and I said, my God, or the God that I believe in, the God of my image, would not do that. And chose to step away from the destiny God had for him. And he says, but what about Jesus? Lee Strobel says to him. He says, yeah, I really miss him. He's chosen to now climb a different mountain. And the problem is that if we understand that evil and the problem of evil is not a philosophical problem. It's become a philosophical problem in the West. Actually, evil was assumed in the Bible. Go read the Bible. It's never really talked about. Why? Because they understood that there were these other gods who had started to act in a wicked, rebellious way. And that our job was to actually come alongside God and to fight against those things. And the problem is we've lost this worldview. And so instead of the gods causing havoc, it now becomes our God who gets blamed for everything. But God is continually fighting this cosmic battle. And so we've lost the biblical answer to the issue or the problem of evil. Greg Boyd says this: when one possesses a vital awareness that in between God and humanity there exists a vast society of spiritual beings who are quite similar or like humans in possessing intelligence, free will, and there is simply no difficulty in reconciling the reality of evil with goodness of the supreme God. It virtually sidesteps the problem of evil. When we bring that worldview back into play, then evil doesn't become the issue that we're worried about, because we know that evil is outside of our God. He didn't create it. I mean, He created those beings, but they chose to act in an evil way. So my question really is in terms of this worldview, if we understand and we have Jesus in the biblical worldview, what we do is we stop wrestling with the philosophy of evil. And what we do is we start to, instead of debating it with professors and one another, what we do is we rather start praying against evil. We start engaging God to act on our behalf, just like we saw in Daniel earlier. We start questioning God about evil, and rather what we do is we fight shoulder to shoulder with God and with one another around these things. And lastly, the implication, actually I've left one out, but is spirituality is, I know many of you are not necessarily involved in the occult. I know some of you may have tried some stuff, Ouija boards and all those weird and wonderful things. Please stay away from them. They are portals for dark, evil powers to work in and through you. And those things are real. But what we don't also understand is that drugs, alcohol, perverted sex, porn, all of these things have a demonic influence that grab a hold of our hearts. Ryan expressed that earlier. They're a foothold, like Ephesians 4:26. Don't let the sun go down in your anger. Why? Because you give the devil a foothold. Gossip and slander. Do you know that if you speak about somebody else, so if I go to Rich and I say, Rich, Louise, she did this to me. And Rich should be saying to me, Gary, have you spoken to Louise? No, I haven't. Okay. What you've done now is you've now put a shadow in my heart towards Louise. I need to go and speak to her, and I'm giving you a week to go and speak to her because I'm going to speak to her if you don't. Why can't we as a community get to that space? Because gossip is actually demonic. And then slander is actually telling lies about people. So gossip is taking something that has a truth to it, but it's actually going to another person and maligning the other person that you actually haven't spoken to, which Matthew 18 says you should. Or Matthew 7 says you should actually go. Sorry, Matthew 5 says if you're at the altar and you're about to take communion, and you're about to worship God, and you know that there's a sin, brother that sinned against you, go sort it out. But we don't do that. We just go tell everybody else. Then the gossip starts. And then somebody starts to get maligned and somebody starts to get talked about in our community. We give the devil a foothold to come and do what he wants, because if he can damage relationships, he's won. All right, I think I've said everything else there. Lastly, I didn't have this one on my list. It's how we think about idolatry. And I've already gone through this in most of what I've said. The Apostle John was 90 years old. And his last words that he penned in 1 John 5:26 is, "Dear children, keep yourselves from idols." So where are you? Where are you? And I could name people. I won't do that. Because as Rich said at the beginning of the meeting, we are created to worship. The question is not whether you are worshiping, it's what you're worshiping. Which mountain are you going up? Is it drugs? Is it alcohol? Is it even a relationship? Is it maybe even sport? It could be any of these things. Sport's a good thing. But if it becomes the ultimate thing, then you're worshiping it. And behind that can be a spiritual being that is pulling you away from God. That's his job. So the question is, what are you giving your life to? Are you giving it to Jesus, or are you giving it to these other gods? Are you giving it to sex, money, power, all of those kind of things? And how do we know what we're worshiping? Well, what are you sacrificing for? In the Old Testament, when they used to take animals and they sacrificed them, remember, sacrifice is an investment. Animals were an investment. What are you doing? You're taking a resource and you're letting it grow over time. And then you're multiplying it as they have more. It's part of what we do today. We go and we invest our funds and our resources. So it's no different. Are you sacrificing those things to God, or are you sacrificing those things to other gods that are pulling you away from Yahweh? Where do you escape to? Is there a bottle? Is it TV? Is it websites? Is it a relationship? Is it gym? Is it sport? What is it? I'm not saying don't use sport as something to help you cope, and exercise is a good thing. But if exercise becomes the thing that you're spending your time and your energy and everything on, and that's where you go because you can't deal with what's in front of you, then it becomes a problem. What are you fearful of? What if you lost today? You would think, oh, it's the end of my life. Like I would hate to lose Louise or one of my kids. It would devastate me. But if I'm so fearful of that, then they've become an idol to me, and I start to live my life based on what they want rather than what God has called me to. And I'm not saying I do that without wisdom. I have done that without wisdom over the years. So, my question to you is, are you going up the right mountain by following Jesus, who's the way, the truth, and the life? Because in him is life. Or as Jesus himself said, do you love Yahweh? Do you love Jesus? Do you love him as your Elohim with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength? And take a stock of where are you going? What mountain are you climbing? And maybe we see mates and friends that are climbing the wrong mountains. Let's bring them to the mountain of the Lord. Because who is able to come? Those with clean hands and a pure heart. And Ryan mentioned that earlier. So let's come together as a community. Let's hold each other's arms. Let's go shoulder to shoulder. And let's make sure that those mountains are not being climbed and wasted times and energy, but we are sitting with Yahweh, the King of all kings, the Lord of all lords. And that's why he says, I am Yahweh, Yahweh, your Elohim. And I am compassionate. And I am gracious. And I am abounding in love and faithfulness. I maintain love to thousands. I forgive wickedness, rebellion, and sin. But I will not let the guilty go unpunished. That is the God we serve. And that is who he says he is. And I'm going to unpack. I'm really looking forward to next week on this compassionate, gracious God. Because when we start to understand who he is, then we start to live out based on the consistency, like I said last week, that God will consistently act like he says he is, because he does not change. Let's stand and worship him.